So I broke up with human religion about 6 months after my parents died. Now, before anyone gets upset, it was a true case of it's not you, it's me. I had not been particularly religious beforehand, but when they passed 2 weeks apart, my mother suddenly, and my father after a long illness, I felt this incredible longing for spiritual wisdom. We'd been close, and I sought their advice regularly, and in my imagination, their advice sprung not just from their own experiences, but from some deep, mysterious well of ancient wisdom, At my father's funeral, I had described him as a mashup of Jean Valjean, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Dumbledore. And that's really how I felt about him and my mom. So, when they died, I just felt cut off from this ancient wisdom, and I subconsciously sought out a substitute. I found myself accepting invitations from friends, to many of you, to go to various houses of worship, to church or synagogue or yoga or guided meditation, and I would always go in with an open heart, but about 2/3 of the way through, this wicked little voice would come up in the back of my mind and would say something like, "Yeah, right. You up there on that altar, on that pedestal, you have ancient wisdom for me, right? Didn't I see you cut the line at TJ's the other day, Didn't I babysit you? Oh my God." And I would always kind of leave feeling a little bitter and angry. Well, one thing I've learned about myself is sometimes my anger is sort of like a scab that conceals some deep, unfaceable fear. And for me, that fear was this: what if I was the wisest person I knew? What if I was the one that was best equipped to weigh in on life's big questions? What if I was the one that was supposed to have ancient wisdom, And this really terrified me. Well, one day I got an invitation, not from a friend to go to church, but from the Franklin Park Zoo, to join in on a citizen science project called Frog Watch, the gist of which is to train volunteers to take a census of local populations of frogs and toads, and I was oddly intrigued, So, So one bright Sunday morning in March, I filed in with a couple others to this classroom there behind the gorilla enclosure, and I met this very peppy young zookeeper who explained. She said, if you're going to identify frogs and toads, you have to do it after dark when they're active. And this means that you have to be able to identify them by sound. And the fastest way to remember the sounds of frogs and toads is to try to mimic their noises. Yeah. So that's what we did for 3 hours. We quacked like wood frogs. They go quack, 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 and we peeped like spring peepers. Knee deep, knee deep, knee deep. My favorite was the American fowler toad. That sounds like he's been fouled on the basketball court. He goes, wah, wah. And so we took our test. We got certified to go forth to our local wetlands. Any puddle would do, and make our observations there. So I was thanking the zookeeper for this really interesting morning, and I casually asked her, I said, hey, there's this poster on the wall of the classroom that said, "Get ready for big night." I said, hey, what's big night? She stopped. She got very serious. She looked me dead in the eye and she said, "Big Night is the most important night of the year for amphibians in New England. It's the one night where millions of salamanders, frogs, and toads make their way from their winter burrows and migrate to their ancestral vernal pools, the pools in which they themselves were hatched, and they mate." I said, "Wow, this one's between me and the door." I said, "Wow, just for one night then?" "Yes, one night, the second rainy night of spring, when temperatures are above freezing." I smiled, and I backed away slowly, as one does when speaking with a lunatic, and I as if to impress upon me the significance of this event, she called out, she said, "It's been going on in New England for 10 million years. Well, that did impress me. 10 million years. I mean, talk about ancient, right? Well, human beings have been around for what, like 5% of that time? Well, in the ensuing weeks, I did go forth, and I did make my initial frog watch observations. And I was surprised because I felt this wonderful relief wash over me as I sat there in the dark and listened. And I turned my mind from, human problems and my grief and whatever problems I was having of the day. And I thought about froggy things, froggy thoughts, And I told a friend about this later, the peace that this sort of ritual data collection, brought me. And she said, "Oh, it sounds like you found your church, Frog Church." And I like that, So anytime I was upset, I'd say, "I'm going to Frog Church," and head on down. Well, it was not to last. Winter came, and I could no longer go to Frog Church, and now there really was nothing between me and this low-grade sense of panic I had about navigating the world as an orphan without the wisdom of my parents. And as it would turn out, that winter, I had to make a lot of really difficult choices about my career and how to support people in my life. And I just felt like every decision I made was like a mistake. Like I was making like a mess of my life, Yeah. And the other thing about that winter was that it went on forever. It was so dark and so cold, well into April. And one particularly bleak morning, I was making breakfast, and I said to my husband, "Is it ever going to be warm and sunny again, And he said, "Oh, sweetheart, at least it's raining, and it's not snowing, and it's not, freezing." "What? Do you think it's the second rainy night in spring when temperatures are above freezing? Do you think it'd be big night?" And I explained, and he smiled, and he backed away slowly, as one does when speaking to a lunatic. And I called after him, "It's been going on," and go on to work there. So he went on to work, and I laid my plans. I thought, I'm going to go out tonight, I decided I would go out to Blakely Horse Sanctuary, which is a small sanctuary there behind Baker School. And as fate would have it, I'd been there once before with Brookline's nature educator, and she had told me two kind of interesting things. She had said, "It's the place to go if you want to see the earliest flowering plant of spring in Brookline, the skunk cabbage." Charming, yeah. And, skunk cabbages kind of are interesting because they're one of the few plants that makes their own heat. And so they melt the snow cover as they bloom, and the warmth of their flower attracts and protects all these little insects that pollinate it and harbor inside it. And she also said that it's a red maple bog, and red maples are one of the trees that don't mind standing water. They like to get their feet wet, as she'd put it. And I thought that's probably a good place to go to try to see amphibians. I could not get away until very late. It was well after midnight when I pulled into the abandoned parking lot there behind Baker. And it was pouring rain. I mean, I could not see the road as I pulled in. And as I got out with my little flashlight that could barely pierce the gloom of the downpour and the mist rising off the snowpack, I thought, that was a terrible idea. What am I even doing out here? I could just imagine the headline in Brookline News. local woman eaten by bog monsters, you know. Oh, I almost turned back. But as soon as I stepped into the sanctuary, I heard it. A thunderous, deafening cacophony of croaking and quacking and peeping and screeching. I ran down to the bog with a flashlight to look for the salamanders and the frogs, and there they were. The wood frogs were just peppering the banks and hopping amongst the skunk cabbages, you know, and their noise utterly transformed the bog. It was as if I had just stepped into the most jubilant celebration, as if I was standing on Bourbon Street, you know, in Mardi Gras, right? And the zookeeper's words came back to me, you know, 10 million years. And then I thought, you know what, that's not quite right, is it? I mean, these particular frogs have not been alive for 10 million years. She'd even said they only lived to be 5 or 6 years tops. And in that festive atmosphere, I allowed myself to consider maybe that notion of ancient wisdom that I had imagined my parents possessed, that I faulted others for lacking, and that I so feared I myself would never have, was a childish fantasy. Maybe my parents were not Dumbledores or Obi-Wans, you know. Maybe they were just wonderful people who love me, you know. And in those moments, I felt overwhelmed by a much bigger, different sense of wisdom. Wisdom as the perception of being alive, and being alive with all these other beings at the same time, you know, as if some shared pulse of energy was animating all of us as it sweeps through time, you know, connecting one generation to the next. And for the first time since they died, I felt my connection to my parents rather than my separation from them. You know, I felt their presence in my life rather than their absence. And this fear I'd had about being alone in the world started to fade. Because whatever I was in the sanctuary that night, I was not alone. I was there with the amorous frogs and the salamanders and the wet-footed maples and the skunk cabbages with their little insects, the bog monsters, and my father and my mother with me, standing in the baptismal waters on the holiest night of the year at Frog Church. Thank you.